Hey everyone. This time we looked at Bible Adventures by Gabe Durham. This is from the Boss Fight book series, and this is a really cool book. It basically goes over the history of color dreams, wisdom tree, and it very briefly, at least in a footnote, touches on bunch games. These three sort of companies were all part of Color Dreams. Gabe kind of draws a distinction between Wisdom Tree and Color Dreams, mentioning that Wisdom Tree had its own sales team and everything like that. For me, I don't really see a huge difference aside from the fact that Wisdom Tree was just like the Christian publishing arm of Color Dreams. I could be wrong, but that's just sort of the way I always saw it. So what Color Dreams was an unlicensed video game publisher. They published many different games for the NES, and all of them were basically unlicensed. Gabe points out they did have one licensed game on the Atari Lynx, and that was Crystal Mines 2. That was something I didn't really know about, and it's kind of cool to see that. Color Dreams also put out games on the Sega Genesis, and at least one game on the Super Nintendo, which was Super 3D Noah's Ark, or Super Noah's Ark 3D, depending on how you want to read the title art. The book starts off with a little bit of history about unlicensed games, and it also touches on a story of how Gabe discovered Bible Adventures. He found it on like one of those The book starts out with a little bit of history on unlicensed games and sort of goes into how Gabe discovered Bible Adventures. It's a pretty cool story, and it's not one that I really would have thought of, especially since Wisdom Tree games were really sold at just Christian bookstores and also at some of like the mom and pop rental places you could rent them. I remember seeing Color Dreams and Baby Boomers, which were two of Color Dreams' games, at one at, I think it was a Family Video or something like that, and the other one was actually at a general store that I would rent movies. Now Gabe got Bible Adventures from like I'm not really sure how to describe it. It was basically at his church they had this cart that had a bunch of Christian books, and it also had Bible Adventures on it. And it sort of went on like the honor system, where you could check out something and then just kind of return it when you were done with it. And that's how he discovered Bible Adventures and one other Christian game that I don't remember it. It's just off the top of my head. We also get into how the unlicensed games got around the NES lockout chip. We start out with Tengen, and then we go into some of the other unlicensed games. And this is kind of a crazy story because there were a whole bunch of different companies that put out unlicensed games. Let's go ahead and just take a look at a bunch of them now. The way Color Dreams got around the NES lockout chip was by having their cartridges sort of shorted out for just a few seconds. It would actually send a charge through the cartridge into the NES, which would cancel out the lockout chip. This was kind of interesting to see because it's very different from the way that Tengen did it. Tengen actually stole the code from the Copyright Office. So you see two different ways that this has been done. I'm not too sure how the other companies did it, where Camerica has their weird switch on the back of their cartridge, where it seems like if you put it in a specific position, it'll short out what the NES does. It's very, very odd. Now, a lot of retailers were threatened by Nintendo to keep these games out of their stores, so they had to go in through a lot of the sort of mom and pop stores. It's kind of funny to find some of these things nowadays because back when I was growing up, you really didn't see a lot of them. Tengen was the exception. They did manage to make it into stores for a little while. But for games like the Bible games that Wisdom Tree put out, those were only available through Christian bookstores. What's really cool about this book is that Gabe was able to actually get interviews with a lot of the Color Dreams employees and the Wisdom Tree employees as well. This was really fascinating for me because you get to hear stories from these people, how they actually made a lot of these games, how they felt while they were making them, because there's this really weird thing going on at Color Dreams where a lot of the developers and everything were either agnostic or atheists, or became atheists from working there, as we get a little story about one of the developers. And the marketing team for Wisdom Tree were all kind of diehard Christians. They saw it as being like their mission to provide these games to people. And so you have this big difference between what the developers were thinking and what the sales team was thinking. So as Gabe goes through the book, he basically leads you through all of the games that Wisdom Tree put out, and he gives you his own personal stories of playing these games, and also relates some of the games to things that he experienced while he was growing up. He's the son of a pastor, and it's really kind of interesting to see his own personal really journey and some of his struggles with that journey as he goes through it. I'm kind of interpreting them as struggles because that's how it read to me. I could be a little bit wrong on that. That's just my own takeaway from it. Particularly the chapter where we get into the game Spiritual Warfare, which is basically a Legend of Zelda clone. And Gabe talks about how that was more of a thing for him in his life. Me personally, I didn't grow up religious, so when I just see Spiritual Warfare, I think, oh, they ripped off Legend of Zelda. And the game meant more to Gabe from reading the book, where you're going around throwing fruit at people who are sort of possessed or are unbelievers, and for some reason they don't attack you immediately after you throw fruit at them. They instead either release a demon or they like confess their sins and whatnot. At least that's kind of what they were going for with the NES game. It's hard to really get that through on just an 8-bit cartridge. I think the part that I was most interested in were the personal experiences of the people that were making these games. And that's something that does get fleshed out a little bit here, where you have them just trying to make the best games that they can with really the restrictions that they had. It's explained that the engine that they were using was not really good, and it was kind of meant for people who didn't have a programming background to jump in and start making games. And that led to a lot of the problems you see with Color Dreams games, where they're just really crappy physics, and it just feels slippery whenever I tried to play them. Like, you're playing the ice level in Mario, but there's no explanation of why you're playing the ice level, and you have no way to really compensate for the ice. One really fascinating thing that they get into is the Hellraiser game that Color Dreams was kind of making, and how that led into Super 3D Noah's Ark. They got the Hellraiser license, which is pretty remarkable that they were able to get it. They paid $50,000 according to the book, and they were trying to make what sounds like a first-person shooter, and they wanted it to be on the NES. And just from reading it, it sounded like they developed something like the Super FX chip for it, and that was going to somehow help the NES really play a first-person shooter. But they mentioned that the cartridge was probably going to cost $100 on release, and the people that were, well, basically the backers for Color Dreams thought that this would somehow affect their religious games, even though the game would have been put out on Color Dreams' label and not on Wisdom Tree. I just wanted to stop for a second and talk a little bit about the Hellraiser game. It wouldn't have been too out of place for them to have made one, even though it is an R-rated horror movie, because you had games like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and even Jaws made into games. So it would have fit in fairly well with the NES library. It still would have been strange, especially coming from an unlicensed property, but it could have been done. Really, the last part of the book goes into retro games, nostalgia, and the fact that Wisdom Tree is still around even today. The Wisdom Tree, Color Dreams, and other unlicensed games get a bad rap, and they get a bad rap for a very good reason, because for the most part, they're not good games. Of the unlicensed games, I think Tengen and Chimerica really made the best ones, and then you get, I think it's American Video Entertainment or something along those lines, Panesian, and then the three that are covered in this book. Those ones are not very good, but the Chimerica and the Tengen games are usually pretty solid. They're not up to the same standards as the rest of the NES games, but you can still play them at least. They're not Action 52 levels of unplayability. So I really did like this book. It's very fascinating to read about unlicensed publishers, just what they had to deal with, the other things that they had to do with distribution, and getting to hear some of Gabe's stories about playing these games, and some of the people that made the games, their stories, is really just icing on the cake for me. Anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up for me today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, or if you didn't, please let me know in the comments below. I always appreciate getting feedback from you guys. Anyway, talk to you all later, and have a great day.